All right, so welcome back, everyone. We are going to resume our symposium, and our next speaker is Tedick, who is Professor Emeritus of Second Language Education at the University of Minnesota. She's worked there for over 30 years, and her research interest, her fields of interest in research are immersion and content-based language education. She's been working on teacher development for content-based language education contexts, and she's published extensively in well-known journals, as well as she's also worked on the edition of some well-known volumes on immersion. And she's co-authored several books in very well-known publishing houses in the field. So I think that it's better to listen to whatever she has to tell us. So please welcome Professor Tedick. Thank you.
About this morning. First, I'm going to talk about the premise underlying CLIL and an inherent dilemma that corresponds to these programs and other content-based language education programs. And I'll also define scaffolding and quickly introduce various types of scaffolds. Then I'll share some examples of those different types of scaffolds. And finally, I'm going to introduce the Kappa model, which is a highly scaffolded instructional sequence that's designed to bring a focus on language form or a language feature within the context of content teaching. And I'll provide some teacher-created examples, one for the primary level and one for the secondary level. Right, so the premise underlying CLIL, that fundamental premise, is that students can learn and teachers can teach both meaningful content, including academic subject matter content, and a new language, or L2, at the same time. So the crux of effective CLIL teaching is content and language integration. Teachers and students have to attend to both content and language if the L2 learning benefits of these school-based programs are to be maximized. And yet focusing on language and content, or language in the context of content instruction, can be a pedagogical challenge for teachers for a variety of reasons. But I'll say why, for a main reason, is that there's an inherent dilemma underlying CLIL and other content-based language programs. Namely, improving students' proficiency requires students' extended use of the language, and its extended use requires higher levels of proficiency. So you have a little bit of a paradox here. So in other words, how can students fully participate in CLIL classrooms in a language that they're still learning and know only partially? And the answer really does lie in scaffolding. So scaffolding refers to different types of support and assistance provided by teachers to help students understand and engage with content at levels higher than they'd be able to reach on their own. Scaffolding is often talked about as temporary support, much like scaffolding that we might see on a building that's undergoing renovation. But in bilingual classrooms and CLIL classrooms, scaffolding should be used from the beginning of the program all the way through to the end, as it's a key instructional strategy that makes these programs possible. As students advance in grade, scaffolding continues to be critical because the content becomes much more demanding, both cognitively and linguistically. What changes is really the nature of this scaffolding as students acquire language and become more adept at producing and comprehending the L2 independently. So scaffolding is essential at the early stages of language acquisition and at the start of a new lesson or unit where content concepts and the language used to articulate those concepts are new to students. However, as students gain language skills and become more familiar with the content, it's equally important to shift the pedagogical emphasis to more language-dependent tasks and techniques. This process is like the ebb and flow of ocean tides. I love these little birds running from the water. kind of like that. When a teacher is introducing new concepts and new language, that tide comes in with heavy scaffolding, and throughout the unit as students gain more independence and are able to handle more language on their own, that teacher scaffolding eases. All right, let me take a few moments to just talk about different types of scaffolds. So in CLIL classrooms, we use scaffolding to promote comprehension of content and also to facilitate student language production. There are three broad types that were categorized initially by Echevarria, Vogt, and Short. When it comes to scaffolding for comprehension, verbal scaffolding involves linguistic redundancy with repetition, paraphrases, synonyms, and many examples, including teacher talk and changing intonation and the rate of speech, as well as the use of gestures and other paraverbals. Verbal scaffolding for production aims to promote learning and to facilitate student language production during classroom interaction, during student-teacher interaction. It includes a variety of corrective feedback types, as well as a balance of display and referential questions. Display questions being those that the teacher knows the answer to, referential questions being those the teacher doesn't know the answer to. And also using follow-up questions to push student output, encourage them to clarify and elaborate their ideas, and so on. And appropriate use of wait time is also key. Procedural scaffolding for comprehension involves activity frames and routines that teachers use to ensure predictability and facilitate comprehension. So routines like think, pair, share, and so on to activate prior knowledge and monitor comprehension. When it comes to production, procedural scaffolding refers to the creation of multiple opportunities for students to use the language in independent ways. So pairing and grouping students thoughtfully, creating learning centers, having students engage in experiments and role plays and simulations and debates and presentations and so on, and making sure there are ample opportunities for students to learn from and with one another. Instructional scaffolding refers to the various devices and materials embedded in activities to facilitate comprehension and support student production. So print and multimedia resources, props, graphs, videos, etc. And also to enhance language production, teachers can use sentence frames or can teach and display familiar language chunks and so on, have word walls and things like that. The excellent examples that Teresa shared this morning of the handout that we were working through is really a combination of all three types of scaffolds here, and is a really brilliant example of all three types working together. So in addition to these three broad categories of scaffolds, there are different ways that scaffolding manifests in classrooms. Teachers engage in reactive approaches or in-the-moment scaffolding, such as questions and feedback, to ensure that oral interaction is a key source of learning. And teachers also take the time to scaffold proactively by pre-planning activities to promote metalinguistic awareness and create opportunities for practice in meaningful contexts. Now we can look at how these different scaffolds interact. Scaffolding for comprehension involves all three main categories, of course, and it is both reactive and proactive, but we see that reactive approaches are primary when it comes to verbal scaffolding. Not a surprise, since this is about classroom discourse and interaction in the classroom, whereas proactive approaches are more prominent for procedural and instructional scaffolding. And we see a very similar kind of pattern for scaffolding for production as well, with reactive approaches corresponding more to verbal and so on. It's important to point out that there's a dynamic relationship between strategies for scaffolding student comprehension and those for scaffolding production, but I've separated them here just for the sake of clarity. And for the remainder of the presentation, I'm going to be focused on scaffolding for student language production, as in my experience, teachers find that more challenging, whereas scaffolding for comprehension tends to come a bit more naturally to teachers. Okay, so Now I'm going to give you some examples of different types of scaffolds. So to reiterate, verbal scaffolding for production aims to promote learning and facilitate production in the context of student-teacher interaction. So different corrective feedback types, different types of questions, and so on. In their seminal study of classroom discourse, Sinclair and Coulthard identified the typical teaching exchange as consisting of 3 moves: the teacher initiation, the student response, and a teacher evaluation. So for example, the teacher asks, "What's the capital of Japan?" Typical display question. Student responds, "Tokyo." And every time I hear Tokyo, I think of La Casa de Papel. Did you guys see that series? I just can't say the word Tokyo without picturing her in my mind. And the teacher replies with an evaluative response, "Yes, that's right." And these types of exchanges have been criticized quite a lot for being a transmission model of teaching, as being very teacher-centered, and for engaging students only minimally. I think that's really the largest concern that I have with that model. Nevertheless, these IRE exchanges are still predominant in classroom discourse because they do help teachers to monitor understanding and to initiate discussion. So what we want to encourage instead is for teachers to follow up student responses with other questions, perhaps to seek justification or counter-arguments. So effective follow-up moves elaborate on student responses, request further explanation or justification, or they can even challenge students' views. They push student output and promote critical thinking. So here are some examples of effective follow-up moves. You can see here to elicit elaboration. What do you mean by that? Or justification, how do you know? Or explanation, so what's the difference between the two examples, and so on. These types of questions are going to push more student output, and then that's going to give rise to the need for more corrective feedback as well. Okay, so this serves as one example of verbal scaffolding, that is follow-up moves to get students to clarify and elaborate their ideas in ways that require higher order thinking and more complex language. Next, procedural scaffolding, again, is about creating multiple opportunities for students to use the language in independent ways, pairing and grouping students thoughtfully, cooperative group learning, simulations, debates, experiments, etc. We want to make sure that students have an opportunity to learn from and with one another. One example of procedural scaffolding that really pushes students' language production involves making sure that teachers plan for more language-demanding activities after students are engaged in experiential learning. Again, hearkening back to the examples that Teresa showed us earlier this morning. But I'm going to draw upon an example here that was shared by Pauline Gibbons. This is in a grade 3 classroom where students are studying magnets. And first they have this small group activity in which students are grouped at tables, and each table has a different set of objects, and the students have to figure out which objects the magnet attracts and which objects it doesn't attract. So let's look at the kind of language that might be produced in an activity such as this. As you can see, there are frequent stops and starts. The language is choppy. There's a lot of verbal pointing with demonstrative pronouns and use of it instead of object names because they have this shared context, right? There's basic vocabulary, one-syllable words, contractions, and verbs are in the present tense to talk about this hands-on experience. So I've seen a lot of teachers organize an activity like this and then follow it up with having students read about magnets. Much more challenging text when you take them from this activity to reading about magnets. But so there are other ways to think about preparing them for or scaffolding that reading and to get them to produce more academic language in the interim. So the teacher can follow up the hands-on activity with reporting tasks. So now imagine that the students in the small groups prepare to share orally with the class what what they had discovered in their hands-on activity. And first, the group works together to prepare the oral report, and one student in each group needs to explain to the class what they found. Now we can see what that language production looks like. Here we see longer chunks of language and explicit naming of objects. We see details with adjectives, some use of more technical vocabulary, and use of verbs are now in the past tense to report on a lived experience. Then next, the teacher can have the students write a brief report on what they found in the hands-on experiment. And here's an example of the language produced by a student. Note here now that there's a need for an introductory sentence to orient the reader. There are stops and starts that are marked by beginnings and ends of complete sentences that are punctuated correctly. There's an embedded clause. There are verbs in the past tense and frequent use of technical and more advanced vocabulary. And then finally, the teacher assigns a text to read, each of the students to read this text independently. And you can see in a portion of the text here. This text reflects abstract communication about a scientific concept. The use of the word magnet is now generic, and there are synonyms to support text comprehension. There's more challenging vocabulary, more complex sentence structures, several embedded clauses, and a participial phrase to indicate cause and effect. There's also nominalization. Attract becomes attraction. And verbs are back in the present tense now to describe continuous reality. So the idea is to move students through a sequence of activities like this to push their language output in progressively more complex tasks before they're assigned a more challenging reading about the topic. Again, this scaffolds the reading process for them and also pushes them to produce more language and more academic language than they did in that initial hands-on activity. So this is an example of procedural scaffolding where the activity involves grouping and student interaction and multiple steps to scaffold a more challenging task for learners. Now if we look at instructional scaffolding, again this refers to various devices and materials embedded in activities to support student production. So print and multimedia resources, graphs and charts and maps, etc. Here we have an example. I know this is a little hard to see, but here we have an example of a graphic organizer that's been crafted to serve as a scaffold for both content and language. At the website, and I will share these slides with Yolanda, but at the website that you see at the bottom of this slide, this is from a project that I worked on with colleagues a number of years ago. And we created 20 graphic organizers that are customizable. You go to the website and you can fill in fields to make them be what you want them to be. This is a typical graphic organizer, a comparison contrast chart, and often these work as phenomenal scaffolds for content, right? For students to organize their ideas that they've been learning about a particular content theme. But it does nothing to scaffold the language that students need to compare and contrast in English. And so what we did is, and again, I want to harken back to what teachers often do. They'll assign pairs to complete a compare-contrast chart or some other graphic organizer, and then they have them either share orally or to write a paragraph, and yet the students don't really have the language that they need to compare and contrast. So these graphic organizers suggest language implications for teachers, and then I think that, can you see where the, yeah, you see this little create your own, there's a little button here at the bottom, and that takes teachers to a planning page where they can figure out what language they would like students to practice, and they fill in all of the fields of the graphic organizer for whatever topic that they're working on. And it also asks them to create an additional language task to get the students to practice compare contrast language. And so as the teachers are working on the planning sheet, the student handout is automatically created, and the final product looks something like this. So here you can see that the topic has been put in animal groups, and it's to compare and contrast animal groups. and they have to complete this graphic organizer together. They have to compare reptiles and amphibians and so on. And then there's this additional language task at the bottom here, which says write at least 2 sentences in the present tense to compare and contrast the animal groups. Write a similarity and a difference. To describe similarity, use the word both in your sentence, and to describe contrast, use whereas. So for example, both reptiles and amphibians are cold-blooded, and amphibians have smooth and moist skin, whereas reptiles are dry and scaly, okay? So the idea, again, is to create this graphic organizer that serves as a scaffold, not just for content, but also for language. And now the students are going to be better prepared to share orally or write a compare-contrast report based on the content of the graphic organizer that they completed. All right, now I am going to turn our attention. I've shown you examples of the different types of scaffolds, and I'd like to now focus on what Roy Lister and I in our book together call the Kappa model. And this is really a model that's designed to assist teachers in integrating a focus on a language form or feature in the context of their content teaching. And as you'll see from the examples that I'll share, the model is highly planned, so it's proactive in nature, and it incorporates the 3 different types of scaffolds. I'll start by saying I love how Pauline Gibbons makes clear that inextricable relationship between language and content and urges teachers to think in terms of uncovering the subject. This is what Teresa was getting at this morning, that teaching students the language of chemistry, right? So it's better to think in terms of uncovering the subject. That is, making the ways of using language and the ways of thinking in the subject explicit to your students. To illustrate this idea, she developed what she calls the hourglass model to guide teaching, which begins with a focus on meaning or learning through language, which is opposed to language through learning. Next, focusing on form, learning about language, and then finally going back to a focus on meaning or learning through language. And you'll see that the Kappa model follows this pattern. So we know that students in CLIL and other content-based programs are really primed to be meaning-oriented. In other words, they're really focused on content. And so they need a focus on, they need a language focus to develop their metalinguistic awareness so that they can learn to detect patterns in the input, enhance their second language skills, and importantly, engage with increasingly complex language. The Kappa model is really a blueprint for developing instructional sequences that incorporate many different scaffolding strategies to provide CLIL teachers one way to integrate a focus on language form during content-driven instructional units. It's comprised of 4 phases: contextualization, awareness, practice, and autonomy, hence Kappa. I'm going to talk about each in turn. Contextualization establishes a meaningful context related to the content, typically by using a text that's been modified to make the target feature appear frequently. Sometimes a teacher needs to alter a text to make sure that there are enough instances of the target form. The text can be written or oral, but the focus in this stage is on the meaning of the text. And that focus on meaning at the start of an instructional unit or sequence is really critical, as according to Nasagi and Fotos, if students can't comprehend a text, they'll most likely not be able to create the required form mapping connections of the language features in the text, even if they're able to notice the form. So beginning instruction by focusing on meaning increases learners' comprehension of the text and prepares them to use that text then to notice and develop understanding about that target feature later. In the awareness phase, the teacher gets the students first to notice the language feature, typically by enhancing the feature in some way, either typographically in a written text through highlighting or using boldface text, for example, or paraverbally through intonation and gestures with an oral text. After the students notice the feature, the teacher guides them to reflect on the feature to help them figure out how that particular language form works in the text. In other words, what the rules are that govern use of that particular form. And then the practice phase gives students opportunities to use the target features in a meaningful yet somewhat controlled or highly structured context. In this way, the teacher can provide corrective feedback specifically focused on that target feature. And then finally, in the autonomy phase, students are directed to use that target language, that target feature or form in a typical communicative task that you would have in the classroom that's related to the content, and the focus returns to meaning in this phase. So the two middle phases really bring students' attention quite overtly to the language form or feature. And each phase entails at least one instructional activity or task, but can and often really must involve more than one activity, depending upon the scope of the sequence. In other words, the CAPA model's flexible, and its use can range from just being a couple of lessons to really planning a lengthy instructional unit. And it's intended as a blueprint to guide the design and implementation of instruction that brings a focus on language in the context of content teaching. So let me reiterate here. The CAPA begins with that focus on content in the contextualization phase, then zooms in on language during awareness and practice, and then returns to that primary focus on content. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the two middle phases. The awareness phase, as I mentioned before, gets at two types of metalinguistic awareness: noticing language features and figuring out and understanding language patterns. And the practice phase provides opportunities to use that target feature in a meaningful way that's linked to the content, but in a context that's structured enough to allow the teacher to provide corrective feedback related to use of the target feature. The practice phase can be a little tricky to plan because you want student use of the target language feature to be repetitive, so they have lots of examples and lots of opportunities to use this form, but at the same time you want it to be meaningful. We don't want to return to the days of meaningless drill activities that students can do on automatic pilot. So there are some aspects to this phase that are important to highlight. So practice basically means engaging in activity with the goal of becoming better at it. And this phase is in part based on skill acquisition theory, which relates to both declarative and procedural knowledge. Declarative being knowing about language, grammatical rules, word definitions, and so on, and procedural knowledge being about the how, the ability to quickly access and apply knowledge of language from long-term memory during actual language use. The challenge in highly content-driven CLIL programs is that declarative knowledge is initially bypassed. So students acquire language, but typically with a lot of errors. So practice activities are intended to promote the proceduralization or automaticity in using a particular target feature after students have developed declarative knowledge about that feature in the awareness phase. Practice isn't only extensive and repetitive, but also communicative. It's meaningful as opposed to mechanical. And it resembles the context in which the learning will be put to use. So examples of the kinds of repetitive yet meaningful practice activities would include surveys, interviews, games, picture description tasks, and so on. And I'm going to show you examples of games that teachers designed. Okay, now I'm going to show you these two examples of the CAPA sequence that were developed by teachers, and I modified them somewhat to make crystal clear the four different phases of the CAPA. And as I go through each of these, keep in mind that the CAPA sequence in these examples takes place within a regular content-driven curricular unit. Therefore, between the phases that I'm showing you here, there's inevitably more content instruction about the curricular themes. The teacher fits in the various CAPA phases where they best fit, and when students' understanding of the content concepts is pretty well developed, especially before you get to awareness. If students are still unclear on content concepts, it's going to be difficult for them to turn their attention to language. So you want to make sure that the meaning and content is really solid first. Okay, this first example comes from Elizabeth Bigler, who was teaching in an English immersion program in Japan. This was for grade 1. And the subject area was health and nutrition, and she had this content objective that students are going to identify activities to maintain a healthy lifestyle. And the language focus, which of course is extremely difficult to acquire in English, that third person S on the third person singular verbs in the present tense. And also the pronunciation of S at the end of words, because it changes. It's either S or Z, right? Okay, so the language objective, first language objective was that students will identify healthy habitual activities using the third person singular of simple present tense verbs, like run, walk, etc. And also that students will distinguish between and be able to produce two N sounds, the S and the Z, for the S on the third person singular verbs. Okay, so in that contextualization phase, the teacher reads a text multiple times, and she draws upon verbal and procedural scaffolding by asking questions to get students to activate their prior knowledge and make connections to the examples in the book. She asks comprehension questions, has students act out the movements that they see in the book, and share their experiences and so on. And as needed, some of the new vocabulary may have to be taught mostly through movement. So when the teachers has determined that the students have developed enough knowledge related to this content, just a couple more examples from the book. This isn't the whole text, obviously. These are just a few excerpts. She moves on to the next phase. And recall that that first part of awareness is noticing. The teacher needs to get the students to notice the form. So here she incorporates instructional scaffolding by using some props, namely a rubber snake and a bee puppet. And she holds one in each hand and reads the book again. And each time she comes to an action verb with an S, and in that third person, she emphasizes the S with the snake or the Z with the bee, okay? And the phase continues with verbal scaffolding while the teacher leads the class in creating hand signals representing each sound. So what the kids ended up coming up with was this movement for snake and this for a bee, okay? And so now she's modeling using the hand signal to correspond to the final S, and then she reads the book again and has the students use those corresponding hand signals and say out loud S or Z at the end of the verb. And this is probably going to involve some discussion about how those two sounds are pronounced, right? Not common sounds in every language. So the awareness, so that basically that's what she has them do. And then the awareness phase continues, now moving from noticing to awareness, or the getting to understand the rule underlying the use of the S on third person singular. And the teacher starts out by asking students questions about this, what types of words these action words are. She reviews the different persons and does this in a very interactive way, having a student jump up and down and say, I jump, and point to a partner, and the partner jumps, and then say, you jump, and then they hold hands, we jump, and this goes on so that they have an opportunity. And then when they look at another student and they're going to be using the third person singular verbs, they have to really emphasize that yes. So she puts a lot of stuff on the board that gets very heavily scaffolded here. Then the goal is to try to bring students to a place where they're able to actually state the rule in simple language. If they're not able to do that in grade 1, the teacher can do that for them, but you can see here with he, she, or it, or a person, place, or thing name, we must put an S on the end of the verb. Typical description of that rule. And then the awareness phase continues, and now with the focus on the end sounds of the verbs. And here you can see all three types of scaffolds in place. The teacher asks them to use their hand signals and also has them touch their throats so that they can feel that vibration with the Z sound and the lack of that vibration with the S sound. And she gives them each group a T-chart containing the different verbs. And I'll show you a picture of it in just a second. She has the same T-chart on the board, and she models the activity by selecting a word, and they have to put it in one column or the other. And she's got, of course, the snake and the bee, so that they have to figure out which end sound each verb has and put them in the correct column. And then she has these groups work together and to place them in the appropriate columns. And then once they've done that, the teacher asks them to put their hands on the neck and throat, and they read all of the words in the snake column, and they read all of the words in the bee column, and so on. And again, feeling their neck to be able to feel that vibration. And then again, she encourages them to see if they can come up with a rule for the various sounds. And you can see with words ending with a vibrating sound, the final S is pronounced like a Z. And with words ending with a non-vibrating sound, the S is pronounced like a S. Okay? Simple rules. Then in the practice activity, the teacher creates multiple sets of cards using pictures from the book, and she also reviews prepositional and noun phrases that they can use to expand sentences such as every afternoon or after school or on the playground and so on, because we use that simple present tense with habitual activity. Otherwise we would use a different present tense, right? So the students play in pairs, and they have a pile of the cards face down, and the first player selects a card from the top, and they have to make a sentence describing what the child in the picture does habitually. And so, for example, a player chooses a card and says, Akio runs home every afternoon, or simply he runs, if that's all they're able to produce. And if they get the sentence correct, the S is on the verb, and the pronunciation is correct, they get to keep the card. And if their partner figures out that they haven't made the sentence correct, or they haven't pronounced the S correctly, they can take over and then steal the card, if you will, from that other student. And the child with the most cards wins. So during the game, here I'll show you just some of the pictures from the book that they had. And we can see how we've got both instructional and procedural scaffolding at play with this activity involving the formation of pairs, the use of the picture cards, and so on. And during the game, the teacher scaffolds verbally by providing corrective feedback throughout that game and discussing the game afterwards with the class, having students share the kinds of sentences they came up with, and so on. And then this would be followed up by other practice activities to ensure that students are approaching proceduralization of the form before engaging in that final phase. And in the final phase, the class is going to make a book called Our Activities. It begins with information gathering that's led by the teacher. She models the use of certain kinds of questions like what do you do after school, or so on, and students share their activities, and she writes them on the board in the first person like this. I walk to school every day, I rock climb on weekends, and so on. And then each student gets a partner, and they have to make a page for the book about their partner, kicking in need for that third person singular. And they can draw pictures or take pictures of their partner, and then they have to write one or more short sentences. And this activity can be done electronically as well. That would facilitate sharing of the book with all of the students. And then later, each child reads their page to the whole class, and the teacher provides feedback as needed, and making sure that the pronunciation is correct of those S's and so on. And then the pages are compiled into a class book that can be shared with other classes and taken home to share with parents. And students are evaluated on both content and language. Okay, so now you've seen an example for the primary level, and I'll show you now this example that was focused on the secondary level and a discourse feature rather than a grammatical form. Again, verbal, procedural, and instructional scaffolding strategies are embedded throughout the sequence. So in the, let me see here. This was developed by Carrie McGuire for content-based ESL in the States, a unit about landforms. And the language objective is that students are going to use participial phrases set off by commas at the end of sentences to indicate cause and effect. So the structure like this: the running water of the river wears away the ground, comma, forming a canyon. Okay. All right, so the contextualization phase begins with the teacher engaging students at the start of the unit with an activity to activate prior knowledge. And students work in groups to see if they can come up with ideas about how particular landforms were created. And then after that is done, the teacher distributes a text that he has modified to include more examples of this particular discourse feature. There was actually only one in the original text, and the teacher modified it quite a bit so that they would show up a lot, whereas the primary school teacher had a text where the form showed up so frequently it wasn't necessary for her to modify it. Okay, and so you can see here, when volcanoes erupt underwater, they can create islands. Lava builds up until it reaches the surface of the ocean, forming an island. Okay, and more instruction about landforms and so on is going to take place before moving on to the next phase. But in this noticing activity first, the sentences containing this discourse feature have been taken from that text, and they've been matched with a picture on a PowerPoint presentation. And the teacher shows a PowerPoint slide and asks students to describe what they see in the picture. And then using PowerPoint animation, the teacher adds the text and asks the student to read the sentence aloud. And I don't think you can see it very well, but the comma and the participial adjective, or that ing verb, are in boldface text. And the class and teacher complete a read aloud of the sentences on the PowerPoint. They say comma out loud. They draw a comma in the air when they reach the end of the first clause. And after drawing the comma, the class and the teacher say that adjective, the participial adjective, with extra stress, especially on the ing, before completing these in a normal voice. So for example, two pieces of the Earth's crust push against each other, comma, making a mountain. Okay? And making that physical gesture to indicate a comma and stressing that ing on the participial adjective will make these two features of this kind of sentence even more salient for students. The awareness phase continues, and the students go back to the text that was modified, and they circle all of the sentences that have that participial phrase. And they click on, they highlight the comma with one color, and then the ing word with another color, and they examine those highlighted sentences together and have a brief conversation about how these sentences show cause and effect. And then with a partner, they complete the following graphic organizer, analyzing these circled sentences. Here's the graphic organizer, and you can see students are prompted to put a verb in the second box, not just the name of the landform. And the teacher guides students in an inductive rule discovery activity, asking students to describe the purpose and rules of the participial phrase once they've finished this graphic organizer. And the teacher writes ideas and rules on the board and asks questions and gives prompts until students are able to come up with a student-friendly rule, describe the first action, insert a comma, and then write the second action using the participle or the ing word. Then in the practice phase, students are organized into teams. There are parts of sentence strips in envelopes. Each team gets an envelope, and they have to create sentences using the two parts and the comma. And the first team to create all of them, both accurate, both in content and language, wins, and that's followed by another practice activity. And then the students engage in I'm just going to keep that there. They engage in a game. There's 5 teams there are teams of 5 students each, and they stand in line, and the person who's first in line is the first to go, and they have an individual whiteboard and a marker, and the teacher shows a brief video clip depicting the formation of a landform, such as how over time a river creates a canyon. And then after the video ends, the teacher gives a signal, and the student with the whiteboard has to write the sentence using that participial phrase. And then the first student to finish wins a point for their team, and then the next person in the team goes, etc. So note how these activities involve writing and reading to create written sentences. This is important because this cause-effect discourse feature appears in written language. It's not at all common in spoken English. So this harkens back to Lightbound's statement that practice needs to resemble the context in which the learning will be put to use. So it's tricky to create really strong practice activities that do just that. And finally, in the autonomy phase, each student creates a poster, and they have to use at least one participial phrase showing cause and effect, and they present their posters at a science fair, and they're evaluated on both content and language for that poster. Okay, let me summarize just briefly again how that the Kappa model works. So this figure shows how the model fits into Gibbon's hourglass model, and it allows for variable emphases to be placed on content and language, as illustrated here in the hourglass figure. It begins with that primary focus on content and then zooms in on language during the awareness and practice phases. Language, therefore, becomes the foreground during awareness and practice, while the content topic continues to provide context, even though it may temporarily slip into the background. During the autonomy phase, the primary instructional focus is again on the content that served as the starting point. So the subject matter topic really should remain constant throughout the sequence, at times in the foreground and at times in the background. We do have some research support for the Kappa model. Guided practice activities, such as the ones that I've described here, in tandem with the awareness phase tasks, were more effective than communicative tasks involving negotiation for meaning in terms of acquisition of particular forms. And form-focused activities that were different from the other kinds of instructional activities going on at the same time tended to be more effective because they required students to shift their attention from meaning to form. And there were 7 quasi-experimental studies done in Canada. In 75% of them, of the 40 post measures that were used in the studies, students receiving the intervention improved more than students who didn't. In addition to some research support, we also have teachers expressing a lot of enthusiasm about the model. I think that you can read these. The font is large enough for you to see this, but I'll just point out this second one here. I felt like the Kappa model gave me the teeth to put it into practice in my own classroom. I felt like before, just throwing darts at a wall and hoping that something would stick. And now I feel like I've got a process for how to focus on language and what I want kids to take from it. Another teacher talked about how she used to spray and pray. Just spray them with language and pray that something sticks. Okay, so in sum, verbal scaffolding, such as effective questions and follow-up moves, scaffolding for language production involves these following: the verbal scaffolding, such as these questions and follow-up moves to push language production; procedural scaffolding, such as grouping students and having that experiential learning lead to more language-demanding tasks; and instructional scaffolding, such as the use of graphic organizers designed to scaffold for both content and language; and then finally the Kappa model to incorporate a focus on language forms or features in the context of content teaching. There is a caveat to all of this, and that is there's absolutely nothing easy about any of it. But it's worth the time and effort that it takes to plan for these types of scaffolds if we're to maximize the language learning benefits of CLIL and other content-based language programs. Yes, Karina, let's go.
Oh, thank you very much, Professor Tedick, for a very informative talk, very interesting indeed. Now we do have some time for questions and or comments. Whoever wants to share any of their thoughts with us. Don't be shy. I might actually have one question. I don't know whether it might fall out of the scope of this talk, but I was wondering about these follow-up questions that we may ask our students to push them into the production of in the language they are learning. When you don't get any answer from them, how can that impact on the motivation of both the learner and the teacher?
That's an interesting question. I think that I think that it could certainly be negative in some ways, but I think that it all depends on how a teacher scaffolds that, right? And I think that there are ways for a teacher to model and encourage with other framing it in different ways and things to encourage students to speak, or getting them to speak in pairs first and then speak out in front of the class. I think there are just lots of ways that you can do that so that it's not just dead silence. Yeah. And they don't feel afraid to do that, right?
Anyone? Come on. The couple model, the students in the...
Is it on?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So we use the couple model with the students in the Masters for Teacher Training. We're going to be secondary school teachers in a CLIL module.
Yeah.
So, and we do it for them to develop micro-teaching activities where they integrate content and language, and I must say it works really well. They see the point, so just wanted to let you know.
Nice to hear. Thank you. You know, it's the kiss of death for somebody after they present it, for nobody to have any questions. It's like, there you go. Yes?
Okay, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering if you can expand a bit more on the training process, because you mentioned at the beginning that when you have low level of proficiency, it's obviously a challenge to think about content. But you train and work with teachers on using this model.
Yeah.
So I was wondering if you can tell us a bit more about how that training go, because if we think of Dario's example, there was an actual research going on.
Yes.
Which obviously allows teachers to work on it and think about it. But in this case, how teachers were able to implement when you have maybe low proficiency of the students on the language? Thank you.
Yeah, there have been a couple of different ways. So Roy Lister and I present this model in our book, but Roy had actually written about it much more earlier, before our book came out. And he's actually done some research projects. He got funding from the Canadian government to engage teachers in this project, and he's written several articles about what that process was like as he took them through the phases. And so it involved workshops over a period of time, and then having teachers carry out aspects in their classrooms, and then he actually went into classrooms, they videotaped, and so on and so forth. And so he had this long process of multiple workshops, teachers implementing the model in their classrooms, coming together to share their perspectives and so on. And he did that a number of times. In my experience, I was teaching a certificate program, which was half of a master's degree, that was specially designed for teachers in CLIL and immersion, bilingual programs, and so on. And so this was an assignment in one of the classes that they had. And so it was a semester-long class, right? And they were also required to carry it out in their classrooms because all of the teachers were practicing at the time. And they reported on it and shared their experiences in classes, and we created a repository because these take a lot of time to put together and to design really well. So we created a repository where the teachers could share their work and so on. But it was a long process. It didn't happen in a day, that's for sure. And so it took a while for teachers to wrap this around. What about you, Anna? How has your training with teachers around Kappa worked?
We did it in the classroom. I mean, in our classroom, they didn't really, they weren't really expected to implement it in actual schools. So they had to think about the context, the level of the learners, the educational level. So they had these contextual features, and they worked in pairs. That was quite interesting.
Yeah.
So they designed the whole activity in pairs, thinking of, for example, some language features in arts or in history or whatever. And then the actual implementation of a micro-teaching, they designed it in pairs, but then each of the two students presented only one of the sequences. Mm-hmm. Either usually the awareness and the practice one, because of course the contextualization one, you know, there's little really to show. Well, you know, it's very, very important, of course.
Okay, thank you very much.